The year is 1864. The war, a jagged scar across the nation, barely touched the secluded hollows of the East Arkansas Ozarks, yet its shadow was long and chilling. For the inhabitants of Haven Ridge, a village clinging to the mountainside, the true conflict was closer, deeper, and infinitely more silent. The air in Haven Ridge was thick with the perpetual scent of pine and an unnerving stillness. The settlement wasn't on any major map, a cluster of rough-hewn cabins, barely visible through the perpetual low-hanging mist that the locals simply called the mountain's breath. It was a place of isolation, where old ways and older fears held a grip tighter than any federal or Confederate army. Our protagonist, Elias Vance, a man in his late 20s whose face was already lined by worry rather than age, wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his brow. Elias was the closest thing Haven Ridge had to a doctor, his medical knowledge a blend of self-taught texts smuggled from cities and the pragmatic, often brutal, mountain remedies. He walked the muddy trail leading to the cabin of Silas Thorne, his feet heavy with dread. The recent spate of sickness was unlike anything he'd ever read about. It wasn't cholera, nor consumption, which had ravaged other communities. This was a decay that worked from the inside out, slow, merciless, and utterly baffling. He reached Silas's cabin, a dark, miserable structure that seemed to sag under the weight of the forest. Inside, the gloom was oppressive. Silas, once a formidable, towering logger, was now a wraith. He lay on a straw mattress, his wife Martha sitting vigil with a face ashen with terror. "Elias, thank the Lord you came," Martha whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Elias knelt beside the bed. Silas's breathing was shallow, his eyes sunken. The affliction wasn't marked by external sores or fever, but by a profound, debilitating weakness and an agonizing joint pain that grew worse each day. "How is the pain, Silas?" Elias asked, his voice low and professional, masking the fear clawing at his throat. Silas's lips barely moved. Like my bones are turning to chalk, Elias. Hollow, breaking just from the weight of the blanket." Elias carefully took Silas's hand. He pressed gently against the man's forearm. Under the loose skin, the bone felt unnervingly brittle, almost like dried wood. The medical term, though Elias only knew it from a worn encyclopedia page, was osteopenia, an extreme, aggressive bone demineralization. "But why? Have you eaten?" Martha nodded, weeping silently. "A little broth. He can barely chew. His jaw—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Elias looked at Silas's face. The cheekbones were too sharp, the orbital ridges too prominent. It was as if the underlying skeletal structure was becoming dominant, calcifying in a brittle, agonizing process. "Silas, I need you to think back." Elias pressed, his gaze locked on the man's. "Did you feel this after you returned from the lower valley last month? Did you drink from a different source? Eat anything unusual?" Silas gritted his teeth, a flicker of raw pain in his eyes. The mountain, the water tasted different, like stone dust, but everyone drinks from the main spring. "No, not the spring," Elias corrected, his attention caught. "The lower valley. You and Thomas went to cut wood near the old copper claim, didn't you? The one near the hollow peak." A visible tremor ran through Silas. Martha suddenly stiffened, her eyes wide with a warning. "Don't speak of that place, Elias," Martha hissed, clutching a small, tarnished silver cross. "That's not God's ground." "It's ground, Martha, nothing more," Elias countered, but his conviction wavered. The hollow peak had always been a place of local superstition. Tales of strange lights and noxious fumes, tales Elias had dismissed as mountain fever dreams. Silas forced out a single, desperate whisper. The air. It was heavy, metallic. Elias felt a cold spike of revelation. Metallic. Not a curse, not a ghost. This was a sickness with a source. Later that evening, the air was sharp with the promise of rain. Elias sat in his own cabin, surrounded by books and bottles of ineffective tinctures. His own father had succumbed to a similar, though less aggressive, wasting illness 20 years ago. The village elders had called it a curse then too. Elias had lived his life trying to prove them wrong. He spread a hand-drawn map of the ridge on his table. The old copper claim, abandoned 20 years ago when the operation failed, supposedly due to a collapse that trapped several miners. It was situated just below the hollow peak, a geological formation notorious for its unnaturally soft, crumbling rock. Forbidden secret, he muttered, recalling the local whispers. The secret wasn't a curse. It was a poison. But what kind of poison could mimic this dreadful, slow, bone-shattering decay? A frantic knocking hammered on his door. It was Deputy Hollis, the closest thing to an authority figure left in Haven Ridge, a nervous man burdened by a badge and a rifle too big for his slight frame. "Elias, it's Elder Tobias," Hollis gasped, his face pale. "He's called a village meeting. He says Silas's sickness isn't natural. He says the forbidden secret has been violated. He's talking about a quarantine, and something worse." Elias grabbed his coat, his fear now hardening into resolve. Tobias, a man steeped in the old mountain lore and rigid in his belief, was dangerous. He would choose fear over reason, superstition over science. "Tell me, Hollis," Elias said, his eyes blazing in the lamplight. "What is Tobias planning?" Hollis shuffled his feet, his gaze darting nervously to the dark woods outside. "He says the sickness can be purified. He says those who violate the secret must be removed from the flock." Elias felt a surge of cold terror. Silas Thorne had just been marked for death, not by his illness, but by the hysteria of his community. The mystery of the bone-wasting disease was now intertwined with a far more immediate and human horror. The clock had started ticking, and the suspense was suffocating. The people of Haven Ridge live in fear, trapped between a mysterious plague and the dark intentions of their own spiritual leader. Will Elias uncover the truth before fear consumes the sick? Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this chilling 10-part saga. The village meeting was not held in the small, simple church, but in the dusty clearing near the community fire pit, a location that spoke more of judgment than prayer. The mood was a volatile mix of panic and righteous indignation, the kind of fear that curdles into cruelty. Elder Tobias, a towering figure whose shadow stretched long in the flickering firelight, stood before the gathering. His face, usually solemn, was now contorted by an intense, zealous fervor. He wore a simple, homespun tunic, but his authority was absolute. "We have sinned against the mountain," Tobias thundered, his voice echoing off the surrounding forest. "We have let the greed of men taint the earth, and now the earth demands its due. The secret, the one we swore never to disturb, has been violated by the Thorns, and their bones are paying the price." A low, fearful murmur rippled through the crowd. Elias stood near the edge, his arms crossed, watching the spark of superstition ignite the tinder of fear. Deputy Hollis stood close to Elias, shifting nervously, his loyalty torn between the elders' tradition and Elias's reason. "It is not a curse, Tobias," Elias interjected, stepping forward. His voice, though calmer, cut through the elders' pronouncements. "It is an illness. Silas and Thomas went near the old claim, and they inhaled something. The symptoms suggest a poison, a mineral contamination." Tobias whirled, his eyes narrowing to slits of condemnation. "Blasphemy! You, Elias Vance, whose own father walked the path of the sick, dare to defy the wisdom of the Ridge? You peddle city nonsense when God's wrath is upon us." "My father died of a wasting disease, yes," Elias conceded, his voice hardening with memory. "And 20 years of research tell me that your curse is the coward's excuse for ignorance. Silas is in pain, and we can help him, but not by cowering and pointing fingers. A woman in the crowd, her face streaked with tears, shouted, "What about Thomas? Thomas is gone. Ran off 2 days ago, afraid of the fever. He carries the poison." The collective gasps confirmed Elias's fear. The fever of panic was spiking. The disappearance of Thomas, the other logger who had gone to the hollow peak, fueled the narrative of the curse and the need for purification. "Thomas fled because he was afraid of you," Elias stated, pointing at Tobias. "He knows that your solution is not a cure, but a pyre." The fire pit seemed to roar in agreement. Tobias took a menacing step toward Elias. "You test my patience, boy. Your own skepticism is a contagion. The book speaks of cleansing. If the body is corrupted, it must be cut away to save the whole." Elias realized the true, terrifying implication of Tobias's words. He wasn't just talking about Silas. He was talking about an absolute purge to save the community from what they perceived as a spreading evil. The meeting dissolved into a shouting match. Tobias, backed by a handful of the most fearful men, declared an immediate, absolute quarantine on Silas Thorne's cabin. No food, no water, no help. "If it is a curse, the isolation will break its hold," Tobias proclaimed. "If it is not, then they will perish, and the rest of us will be spared their defilement. The secret must be protected." Elias knew he couldn't fight the mass hysteria alone. He rushed back to his cabin, the threat of the quarantine a suffocating presence. He needed to find Thomas, the other victim, and he needed to find proof of a mineral poison, fast. He pulled out his father's old journal, a brittle, leather-bound volume Elias had studied for years. His father's entries from 2 decades ago were maddeningly vague, filled with observational details about his own symptoms and local folklore about the hollow sickness. August 1844. "The ache in my bones is an unnatural thing. I feel the granite beneath my feet is leaching the strength from my marrow. The Copper Co. men left today. Said the ore was too hot, too volatile. Strange language for a simple mineral claim. They sealed the main shaft, a great iron door, and the local men, led by a younger, fearful Tobias, swore a covenant of silence." Elias slammed the book shut. Too hot. Not a curse, a mineral. But what mineral common in copper mining could cause such severe bone damage? He needed to get to the claim, the sealed shaft. And he needed help. He found Abigail, the village midwife and herb gatherer, a woman fiercely pragmatic, and one of the few who still trusted Elias. She was tending her small garden under the fading light. "They've gone mad, Abby," Elias said, his voice tight. "Tobias has quarantined Silas. He'll starve them out." Abigail didn't look up, her hands working fast to pull roots. "Madness is easy in this darkness, Elias. Fear is their meat." She finally looked at him, her eyes old and steady. "You're going to the hollow peak, aren't you? To the claim." "I have to. The answer is there, and I need to find Thomas. He has to be hiding near the old claim, where he thinks he's safe." Abigail straightened, holding a root mass. "The path is treacherous, and Tobias will have sent his hounds to watch. He doesn't want the truth to surface. He's been guarding that secret for 20 years. "Why, Abby? What did they hide?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the peak. "Not just the mineral, Elias. They hid what the mineral did. The miners who got sick. The ones who didn't make it out. Your father tried to tell them. That's why he was ostracized." She looked back at Elias. "There's a small, unused ventilation tunnel north side of the main shaft, used for emergencies. I know where it is. I can show you, but only under the deep cover of the fog. Meet me at the old oak at midnight, and be armed." Tobias is no longer a shepherd. He's a warden. Elias nodded. The realization that he was now operating outside the law, outside the community, chilling him to the core. The atmosphere was turning against him as surely as the acid air was turning Silas's bones to powder. He was now a target, his skepticism a perceived infection. The search for a cure had become a desperate race against a fearful mob, driven by a powerful, manipulative man. He walked back to his cabin, the smell of wood smoke and ash now mingling with the metallic tang of suspense. The true terror was the slow, methodical cruelty of men driven by blind faith. The night was a smothering black blanket, the air thick and motionless. The mountain's breath, that low, cold mist, had descended, wrapping Haven Ridge in a shroud. It was the perfect cover for secrecy and for murder. Elias, gripping a sturdy iron pry bar he intended to use as both tool and weapon, met Abigail at the old oak. The ancient tree, gnarled and vast, stood as a silent witness to generations of mountain secrets. "They're watching the main trail," Abigail whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. She carried a dim, shielded lantern, its light barely piercing the fog. Tobias and 3 of his men, the Denson brothers and old Cale. They are patrolling the base of the hollow peak. They think you'll try to pry open the main door. "I have no intention of going near that iron behemoth," Elias said, his breath ghosting in the cold air. "Lead the way, Abby. We need that ventilation tunnel." They moved with the practiced silence of mountain people, navigating the treacherous, uneven terrain. The woods were dense, a claustrophobic maze of tangled undergrowth and unseen obstacles. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots and the heavy, pounding rhythm of Elias's own heart. As they ascended, the atmosphere changed. The usual earthy scent of the forest was gradually replaced by a dry, mineral tang, a smell Elias recognized from the few mining texts he owned, the faint, acrid scent of sulfur and decay. The mist here was heavier, clinging, and felt strangely gritty on the skin. "The tunnel is just past that rock slide," Abigail murmured, pointing towards a jagged scar on the mountainside. "It's small. You'll have to crawl for the first 10 feet. After that, it should open up." They reached the tunnel entrance. It was barely a fissure in the rock face, choked with roots and fallen debris. Elias knelt, shining his lantern inside. The air that drifted out was stale and heavy, carrying a stronger odor of rot and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of old coins and rust. "You wait here, Abby," Elias instructed. "If I'm not back in an hour, head straight to town. Raise the alarm, tell Hollis what you know. Don't wait for me." Abigail placed a trembling hand on his arm. "Be careful, Elias. You're not just looking for a poison. You're looking for a lie they've built their lives around." Elias nodded, then squeezed his way into the narrow passage. The earth pressed in on him, cold and damp. He crawled, the iron bar scraping against the low rock ceiling. The initial 10 feet were agonizing, a test of will and nerve. Then the tunnel opened up. He stood in a rough-hewn passage, wider but still low, carved out of the mountain's soft stone. The air was noticeably warmer, the smell of sulfur and minerals stronger. He noted the walls, which were streaked with unnatural colors, pale green, sickly yellow, and an unsettling powdery white residue. He followed the winding passage. The silence of the mountain here was profound, broken only by the drip of water and the occasional unsettling creak deep within the mountain structure. Elias kept thinking about the brittle feel of Silas's bones, the agony in his joints. This place, he realized, was the factory of that pain. He stopped. The tunnel opened into a small, irregular cavern. In the center lay the figure of a man, curled up, shivering violently. "Thomas!" Elias rushed forward, dropping his bar. Thomas, the missing logger, was alive but barely coherent. He was thinner than Silas, his eyes rolling back in his head. His breathing was shallow. He had clearly been here for days, hiding from the fear that stalked the village. "Water. Water is poison," Thomas mumbled, his voice a dried husk. "They said it was a curse. They lied. They lied." "Who lied, Thomas? The miners? The copper company?" Elias knelt beside him. He noticed a few small damp bundles near Thomas, some dried bread, a piece of meat and a small flask. "Did you bring this food from the village?" "No." "Found it," Thomas whispered, pointing a skeletal finger toward a dark corner of the cave. "Left for the trapped ones. 20 years ago. Kept the bad away." Elias looked at the corner. There was a niche, partially obscured by a fresh-looking rockfall. He moved toward it, his lantern light revealing not food, but a pile of rags and a rusted metal box. The box was sealed, heavy. Next to it, he saw a scattering of small grayish pebbles and a patch of white, dry powder. He reached down and picked up a piece of the white powder on his finger. He brought it close to the lantern. It was oddly luminescent in the low light, reflecting a faint, sickly green. As his mind raced through his books, a single, horrifying word formed: arsenic. A common byproduct of copper mining, particularly potent in the Ozark region. It causes muscle-wasting nerve damage and, in high concentrations, death. But the bone decay was too specific. He turned back to the stones. They were a dull gray, speckled with green. Uraninite. Highly improbable for a simple copper claim. Elias felt a moment of despair. Arsenic was bad, but it didn't fully explain the bone disease. He needed more. He looked back at the rusted metal box. He took the iron bar and used it as a wedge, forcing the rusted lid open with a terrible, shrieking sound of tearing metal. Inside, resting on a bed of old documents, was a small, crudely sealed glass jar containing a handful of the same grayish, greenish speckled pebbles. The note wrapped around the jar was written in an educated hand, unlike the rough scrawl of the local folk. Elias unfolded the note, his heart pounding. The letterhead was crisp, bearing the stamp of the Ozark Mineral Exploration Co., and dated 1844. He read the first line, and the true, chilling nature of the forbidden secret slammed into him. To our investors, the copper yield is minimal, but the secondary element, sample B, is unprecedentedly high in radium and uranium-bearing minerals. The men exposed to the dust are showing rapid, concerning skeletal decay, far beyond typical mineral poisoning. We have sealed the mine and paid off the local elder, Tobias, to maintain the curse narrative. We must prevent a panic and a government investigation. The location remains viable for a future specialized extraction. Seal this box with Thomas, the last surviving foreman, and leave it in the vent. He knows too much. Elias stumbled back, dropping the note. Radium, uranium. Not a curse, not common arsenic. Radiation poisoning. A slow, invisible killer that targeted the body's calcium, replacing it with radioactive decay that shattered the bones from within. The hollow sickness, the chalk bones, the aggressive osteopenia. It all made terrifying, devastating sense. The copper company had discovered a radioactive ore and, to avoid ruin and scandal, had deliberately created a myth, bribed the elder, and sealed the sick, including Thomas and Elias's own father, away to die. But Thomas was still alive, having survived on limited air and water. He was a witness. Elias looked up. A shadow flickered in the vent opening above, now completely dark without Abigail's lantern. "Elias," a voice called out, low and dangerous. It was Kyle, one of Tobias's men. "We heard the scraping. Come out now, or we'll seal this hole with you and your poison inside." Elias was trapped. He held the box and the paper, the only physical evidence of the ultimate betrayal. The true secret wasn't the curse. It was the chilling, cold-blooded corporate and spiritual conspiracy to hide the poison in the earth. He had to get Thomas out, and he had to use this evidence to break Tobias's hold before the quarantine of Silas turned into murder. The metallic tang in the air suddenly tasted like blood in Elias's mouth. The shadow of Kyle at the tunnel entrance was the personification of the elder's trap. Retreat was impossible. The entrance was a bottleneck. Elias quickly shoved the metal box, the document, and the jar of radioactive ore into the large inner pocket of his coat. He knew this evidence was his only weapon against Tobias, a weapon of truth against a shield of faith. He grabbed the iron pry bar. "Thomas," he said, speaking quickly, urgently, "we need to move. There's a way out, isn't there? A shaft, a side passage?" Thomas moaned, barely conscious. "Water. The lower sump. It leads to the stream." Elias looked toward the back of the cavern. There, partially hidden by a pile of rubble and old mining equipment, was a hole, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, leading downward. He couldn't risk the tunnel. He had to go deeper into the mountain. "I know you're up there, Kyle." Elias shouted toward the ventilation shaft, his voice echoing unnervingly. "I have Thomas, and I have proof that this mountain is poisoning us. This is not a curse, it's a cover-up." Silence met his challenge. Then a low, grating sound. Kyle was moving something heavy, likely a large slab of rock, to seal the opening. Crack. The sound of stone hitting stone sealed the tunnel, plunging Elias and Thomas into absolute, suffocating darkness. Kyle had left them to die. Elias fumbled for his lantern, his hands shaking. The small flame brought scant comfort. He turned to the sump hole. It was a perilous drop, the kind of vertical passage miners use to access lower veins or drainage points. "Stay with me, Thomas." Elias grunted, carefully hoisting the emaciated man onto his shoulder. Thomas weighed almost nothing, a testament to the skeletal wasting that consumed him. Elias located a series of rusty, treacherous footholds carved into the rock. He began his descent, the radioactive dust clinging to his clothes, the iron bar dangling from his belt. Every downward step was a prayer. The darkness below was absolute, and the air grew colder and damper as he went. After a terrifying few minutes, his feet touched a rough, flat floor. He was in a small, flooded lower chamber. The air here was heavy with the smell of stagnant water and deep earth. He lowered Thomas onto a dry ledge of rock. The man's fever was spiking, his body convulsing. Elias had to work fast. He saw the water, a still, dark pool reflecting his lantern light. It was a sump, designed to collect water before it drained into the valley's lower stream, the stream that fed the secondary water source for Haven Ridge. This was the contamination point. Elias found the drainage outlet, a narrow metal grate covered in thick, sticky grayish silt. He knelt and used the iron bar to scrape away a sample of the silt, sealing it carefully in a small, empty medicine bottle he carried. This, combined with the radium ore and the document, would be irrefutable. But before he could celebrate his small victory, he heard voices, not from above, but from a side passage in the lower chamber. The elder said to search the lower drainage. If the doctor went in, he had to come out this way. It was the voice of one of the Denson brothers. They were already inside the mountain, working their way up from the stream bed. Elias quickly extinguished his lantern, plunging them into darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was not just trying to find a cure. He was on the run from a coordinated attempt to silence him. He pushed Thomas deeper into the shadows, covering him with a frayed piece of tarpaulin he found discarded nearby. Elias held his breath, listening to the echoing approach of the men. He could see a faint, dancing light approaching the entrance of the chamber. As the light drew nearer, Elias realized the full horror of his situation. He was standing on the very ground that was poisoning his community, trapped between a fragile, dying witness and men who intended to bury the truth with violence. The Denson brothers, massive, rough men with hard faces, entered the chamber, their lanterns swinging. They saw the disturbed sump, the fresh scrape marks from the iron bar, and the faint, unsettling shine of the radioactive silt. "He's been here," one of them growled, kicking the side of the sump. "The bastard knows." Elias, crouched in the absolute blackness, waited for them to move deeper. He heard the metallic clink of a pistol being cocked. Elder Tobias said if we find the body, we bury it deep, right here. The second brother said, his voice cold and devoid of remorse. Said the mountain will swallow its secrets. The light was getting closer to Elias's hiding spot. He had to act. With a sudden guttural roar, Elias lunged out of the darkness, his iron bar swinging in a wide, desperate arc. The bar connected with the skull of the first Denson brother with a sickening thud. The man dropped without a sound, his lantern clattering and shattering on the rock floor, plunging half the room into shadow. The second brother cried out in surprise, momentarily disoriented. Elias, fueled by adrenaline and the rage of discovery, brought the bar down again, blocking the path of the cocked pistol. The heavy impact jarred his arm, but he managed to force the man back, creating a crucial moment of distance. "You can't bury the truth," Elias yelled, breathing hard, the words tasting like copper and fear. "You're a dead man, Vance. You're infected with lies." The man shouted back, recovering and leveling the pistol. Elias didn't wait. He scrambled back toward the sump drain, the hole Thomas had mentioned. It was a perilous, water-filled channel, barely wide enough to navigate, but it was his only chance. He was now a fugitive, a murderer of necessity, and a carrier of the truth. He plunged into the ice-cold dark water of the drain, praying the current would carry him to safety, the metal box and the crucial evidence pressed tight against his chest. The gunshot that followed was deafening, the bullet impacting the rock where his head had been just a second before. He was submerged, the cold water stinging his eyes, the suspense of the chase now a tangible, terrifying pressure. The drain channel was a black, icy artery of the mountain, a relentless current of stagnant, mineral-laden water. Elias was swept along, battered against the rough-hewn stone walls, his lungs burning. He clung desperately to his coat, protecting the metal box and the vile silt sample, the only things that could save Haven Ridge. He felt the channel gradually widen and slope upwards, signaling the end of the mine's internal drainage system. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he pulled himself out of the water, coughing and gasping, onto the bank of the lower stream. The water that ran here was cold, clear and fast, diluting the deadly runoff from the mine, but still carrying the invisible poison downstream. He lay there for a moment, exhausted and shivering, the sulphurous smell of the mine slowly being washed away by the pine-scented mountain air. He had survived the mountain's depths, but he was still a fugitive. He had left one of Tobias's men dead, and the other would be hunting him with ruthless intent. He had to get Thomas out. He backtracked slowly and cautiously, moving parallel to the stream. After about 100 yards, he found a narrow game trail that led back up the slope toward the ventilation tunnel entrance where he had found Thomas. He moved with heightened senses, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounding like a coming executioner. He reached the rock face and found the body of the Denson brother he had struck. The man was still alive, groaning and bleeding profusely from a severe head wound, but clearly out of the fight. Elias moved past him, scrambling back to the lower chamber. He found Thomas exactly where he had left him, covered in the tarpaulin, barely breathing. "We're moving, Thomas," Elias whispered, lifting the frail man onto his back. "Just hold on. We're getting out of the valley." The ascent out of the lower chamber was slow, agonizing, and excruciatingly loud in the oppressive silence of the mountain. Elias had to use one hand to carry Thomas and the other to grip the iron holds. When they finally reached the ventilation tunnel, Elias pushed Thomas out first, then followed. The opening was still sealed by the massive rock Kyle had rolled into place. They were trapped. "Kyle!" Elias yelled, his voice strained. "Kyle! We're coming out! The Denson brother is injured!" "He needs help." Silence. Then a chilling voice from above the sealed opening. "The Elder knows everything, Vance. You murdered my brother. You don't leave this mountain alive. The secret stays buried." Elias realized they weren't just sealed in. Kyle was waiting, armed. He couldn't risk the main tunnel. "Abigail!" Elias shouted, hoping the midwife was still waiting at the old oak, perhaps close enough to hear. No response. Elias lowered Thomas to the ground, his mind racing. He was pinned against the sealed entrance of the mine, the living proof of the company's betrayal dying in his arms, and a vengeful man waiting above. He felt the cold, gritty mist pressing in. He needed a distraction. He reached into his coat and pulled out the jar of radioactive ore. He unsealed it and tossed the heavy pebbles as hard as he could against the rock face above the tunnel entrance. Clack! 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 The sharp, unnatural noise echoed in the stillness. Cale shifted, momentarily distracted by the sound. What was that? What are you throwing, Vance? Elias used the moment. He pulled the iron pry bar and began savagely attacking the roots and debris around the sides of the rock Cale had used to seal the tunnel, not the center. He was looking for the weak point, hoping the soft, crumbling stone of the mountain would yield. He noticed a section of the tunnel wall had a large stress fracture, already weakened from decades of blasting. He jammed the pry bar into the crack and leveraged his entire weight against it. With a groan that seemed to come from the mountain's very core, the section of the tunnel wall gave way, not at the entrance, but to the side, creating a small secondary escape hole. Elias pulled Thomas through, falling into the thickest part of the mountain's breadth. He had to move fast before Cale realized what had happened. They moved downhill, away from the hollow peak, using the cover of the dense fog. Elias was exhausted, bruised, and carrying a dying man, but the adrenaline of the chase kept him moving. As they reached the relative safety of the lower slopes, the fog began to thin, revealing the dense, dark forest. Elias put Thomas down behind a massive, moss-covered boulder. He pulled the sealed glass jar out of his pocket and stared at the gray, speckled rocks inside. This was the curse. This was the forbidden secret. Suddenly, a sound of heavy footsteps. Not Cale's. These were different. More cautious, more deliberate. A figure emerged from the thinning mist. It was Deputy Hollis, his rifle lowered, his expression a complicated mix of fear and relief. "Elias, Abigail saw Cale and the Denson brothers heading up the ridge and came straight to me. She said Tobias was planning a hunt. Thank God you're alive." Elias collapsed onto the wet ground. "Hollis, I have Thomas. He's dying, and I have the truth." He showed Hollis the letter, the jar of ore, and the silt sample. "It's not a curse, Hollis. It's radium poisoning. The copper company covered it up, and Tobias has been protecting that lie for 20 years. Hollis read the document, his face turning pale in the faint moonlight. The truth was worse than any superstitious horror. He looked at Thomas, the living, skeletal proof. "We have to take this to the village," Hollis said, his voice shaky but resolute. "We have to show them." "No," Elias countered, shaking his head. "If we go to the village, Tobias will rally the people and claim this is a forgery, a lie from a man who murdered his followers. We need to go to Silas and Martha. They are the key. We show Martha the proof, and she will be our witness to the community. Tobias can't silence a grieving wife." Hollis agreed. They started the slow, painful journey toward Haven Ridge. They had proof, they had a witness, and they had a plan. But Elias knew Tobias was not a man to accept defeat. The elder would be waiting for them at Silas Thorne's cabin, ready to execute his final deadly plan of purification. The journey back to Haven Ridge was a cold, brutal slog. Elias and Hollis moved through the undergrowth, avoiding the main trails. Every shadow seemed to hold the promise of Cale or the remaining Denson brother. Thomas, delirious and near death, was a heavy, constant reminder of the stakes. Dawn was just beginning to etch a faint silver line over the eastern peaks when they reached the outskirts of the settlement. The mountain's breath was lifting, exposing the cabins to the pale, uncertain light. They approached Silas Thorne's cabin from the rear. The windows were shuttered, the air around it heavy with the silence of the siege. Elias spotted the watchman, 2 other men from Tobias's inner circle. Elder Tobias himself was nowhere in sight. Tobias must be inside, or waiting at his own cabin to receive a report. Elias whispered to Hollis, "You distract the men. I'll go to Silas and Martha. We have to show Martha the evidence first." Hollis, gripping his rifle, nodded, his fear replaced by a nervous determination. "Be quick, Elias. The longer Silas is alive, the more dangerous Tobias becomes." Hollis stepped into the open, calling out with a forced air of authority, "Boys, Elder Tobias wants you to report. The search for Vance is over. He's fled the ridge. You're needed for the purification ceremony." The 2 guards hesitated, their attention drawn to the deputy's unexpected appearance. Hollis's voice was shaky, but the mention of Tobias and the ceremony was enough. As they moved away from the cabin door, Elias slipped silently to the rear window. He used his iron bar to pry open the shutter, then gently eased himself through the narrow opening. The cabin air was stifling, heavy with the smell of unwashed linen and sickness. Martha was asleep in a chair beside the fireless hearth, her exhaustion complete. Silas lay on the bed, his breathing shallow and rattling. Elias knelt beside Silas. "Silas, it's Elias. I need you to wake up. I have Thomas, and I know what's happening to you." Silas's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at Elias, a flicker of weak recognition in his sunken gaze. The chalk, the bone ache. Elias pulled the sealed document from his coat, the official letterhead, the crisp 1844 date. The damning words about radium and the cover-up were clearly visible. "Silas," Elias said, placing the document in the man's frail hand. "You were not cursed. You were poisoned. The copper company and Tobias covered it up 20 years ago. They thought they could bury the truth." Silas stared at the paper, his lips moving silently, forming the words. A lifetime of fear, shame, and agony was suddenly reframed as betrayal. Tears began to track paths through the grime on his cheeks. A profound, shattering understanding filled his eyes. "My fault," he whispered, a rasping confession. "Not the secret. My greed. We cut the wood, we saw the seal, and we went too close. We drank the water from the upper cistern. We knew. We shouldn't have." At that moment, Martha awoke, startled. She saw Elias, the document, and the profound, tortured expression on her husband's face. "Elias, what have you done? You bring your city lies into this holy place?" she cried, but her accusation was weak, undercut by the terror in her eyes. "Martha, look at him," Elias commanded, pointing to the paper clutched in Silas's hand. "Your husband is dying, not by God's will, but by the poison of that mine and the lie of that man." Martha approached slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at the document, then at Silas. Silas, with the last vestige of his strength, pressed the paper into her hand. "Forgive me, Martha," he rasped. "The lie. It killed us, not the mountain." Silas closed his eyes, his breathing slowing, becoming irregular. His confession was his last, excruciating act of honesty. Martha read the words, the corporate stamp, the cold language of mineral yields, the clinical acknowledgement of skeletal decay, and the name, Tobias. The man she had trusted, the man who had promised her purification, had knowingly let her husband and so many others suffer under a malicious, fabricated curse. Her denial crumbled. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a ferocious, terrifying clarity of purpose. She clutched the document, a sound of heavy footsteps outside the cabin. The door burst open. It was Elder Tobias, followed by Cale, who was heavily armed and covered in dirt, and the 2 distracted guards. Tobias's face was dark with fury. "I knew you would crawl back, heretic. You bring your defilement into this sacred place. Kyle, shoot him, now." Kyle raised his rifle, but Martha stepped out in front of Elias, facing the elder, the document held high like a sacred scroll. "Stop!" Martha's scream was raw, guttural, a sound of decades of repressed grief and terror finally unleashed. "You lied to us, Tobias. You lied. This is not a curse. This is the proof." She thrust the paper at the elder. Tobias paled, his eyes darting from the paper to Martha's face. The guards hesitated, confused by Martha's sudden defiance. "It's a forgery, a deception by this madman," Tobias shouted, lunging forward to snatch the document. Elias blocked him, shoving Tobias back into the hearth. "It's the truth, Tobias. You buried Thomas alive and let my father die, all to protect the gold of a company that abandoned you. You traded the lives of this community for a lie." The ensuing chaos was a violent blur. Kyle rushed forward, but Hollis, having secured the rear, burst into the cabin, rifle leveled. "Deputy's orders, Kyle. Stand down. This is a murder scene." The men were momentarily paralyzed. The deputy's presence, the dying man, Martha's hysteria, and the visible evidence creating an unbearable tension. Elias knew he had to solidify the truth now, before Tobias could seize control again. He pointed at the jar of radioactive ore, glinting sickly green in the dawn light. "That," Elias shouted, "is the poison. The mountain is filled with it, and Tobias knew. He has been the true curse upon this ridge for 20 years. The stalemate in Silas's cabin was a suffocating tableau of raw human emotion. Elias, battered but resolute. Martha, standing sentinel with the proof. Hollis, holding the line with a shaky rifle. And Elder Tobias, cornered, his authority crumbling into panic. "They are infected," Tobias roared, appealing to his loyalists. "They spread lies, burn the paper, silence the heretics." Kyle, driven by vengeance for his brother and loyalty to the elder, ignored Hollis and lunged toward Elias. Hollis fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The deafening blast of the rifle filled the tiny cabin, sending plaster and dust raining down. "The next one finds a target, Kyle. Stand down," Hollis yelled, his face slick with sweat. The two loyal guards hesitated, looking from the deputy to the elder. Tobias's desperation was now palpable, his zealotry replaced by cold fear. Elias seized the opportunity. "The other victim is outside," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of truth. "Thomas, who was left to die in the mine. Martha, show them." Martha, her hands trembling, pushed open the cabin door and stepped out into the nascent morning light. She held the document and pointed toward where Hollis had placed Thomas's frail body, covered by a blanket near the rear woodshed. The loyalists, compelled by morbid curiosity, slowly edged out of the cabin. They found Thomas, a shocking skeletal figure, clearly not afflicted by any common disease. He was the living, dying testament to the hollow sickness. As the men recoiled, Tobias made a last, desperate move. He feigned a surrender, his hands raised, his voice a theatrical plea. "I only sought to protect you, my children. That madman, Vance, he twisted the words, he manipulated the truth." But Elias was ready. "Protect us. You buried the report, Tobias. You took the company's silence money and watched us suffer the curse you created. You let my father die of the same poison 20 years ago." Elias pulled out the sealed jar of silt he had scraped from the sump. "This, gentlemen, is the truth of your well water. This came from the mountain's drain. It's a poison that makes the bones brittle, that calcifies the body. We are not cursed. We are victims of a mineral, and this man made us fear the only man who could cure us." The three loyalists, seeing the physical proof, the document, and the dying Thomas, finally broke. Doubt turned to fury. "You let us suffer. My child drank this water," one of the guards shouted, dropping his rifle. Tobias saw his authority dissolve. There was no faith left to shield him. He turned and bolted, sprinting for the cover of the deeper woods toward the only place he knew to hide. The sealed mine, on the hollow peak. "He's fleeing to the mine," Elias yelled. "He'll destroy the evidence. Hollis, we need to secure the documents." Hollis and the others, their allegiance firmly shifted, gave chase. But Elias stayed behind. Silas had died moments after his confession, his face finally at peace. Elias knew the climax of this terrible drama would not be the capture of Tobias, but the final, brutal confrontation with the forbidden secret itself. He knelt by Martha, who still clutched the document. "Martha, you need to tell everyone. Show them the truth. I have to go to the peak. Tobias cannot be allowed to destroy the main report." Martha looked at him, her eyes burning with resolve. "Go, Elias. I will not let this truth be buried again. I will be your witness." Elias took his iron bar and began the grueling climb back up to the hollow peak. He found Tobias there, huddled near the massive rusted iron door of the main shaft, the original seal placed 20 years ago by the mining company. The elder was attempting, in a frenzy of panic, to chip away at the heavy iron rivets, his eyes wild. "You won't have it, Vance," Tobias screamed, seeing Elias approach. "You won't destroy the faith. This faith kept us safe. The truth will shatter the ridge." "The lie shattered the ridge, Tobias," Elias shouted, stepping closer. "Your faith was a shield for your corruption." The elder stopped trying to pry open the door. He turned and lunged at Elias, not with a weapon, but with the primal, desperate strength of a man who has lost everything. The fight was brutal, fueled by 2 decades of suppressed anger and betrayal. They grappled on the muddy, loose stone near the entrance, Elias fighting for the lives of his community, Tobias fighting for the preservation of his own terrible secret. Elias managed to leverage the iron bar, forcing the elder to stumble backward. Tobias fell, his hand landing on a thick piece of copper wire, one of the remnants of the mining operation. He snatched it up, twisting it into a makeshift garrote. "The mountain will take you," Tobias spat, lunging again. Elias dodged the attack. He saw a pile of loose rock, the same crumbling, brittle stone that made the hollow peak so unstable. He drove the sharp end of the pry bar into the rock directly behind Tobias. The impact was the final straw for the mountain's fragile structure. With a terrifying crack, the ground beneath Tobias's feet shifted. A tremendous roar erupted. The slope gave way. Tobias screamed, a sound cut short as he plunged downward into a newly opened fissure. The rocks and soil rained down, sealing him in the earth he had corrupted. Elias stood at the edge of the collapse, breathing hard, watching the dust settle. The elder was gone, buried not by a curse, but by the physical instability of the mountain itself. The unstable, mineral-laden rock that contained the true secret. He looked at the iron door. The main shaft was still sealed, but now the mountain had delivered its own final judgment, burying the guilty party at the source of the poison. Elias had secured the truth. Now he had to secure the future. The elder is gone, but the truth remains. A slow, invisible poison is killing Haven Ridge. What steps must Elias take to save his people from the contaminated water and the invisible radiation? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for the final, terrifying chapters of this story. The sun, now fully risen, cast long, stark shadows across the scarred face of the hollow peak. The air was cool, but a deep, pervasive weariness settled over Elias. He had survived the confrontation, but the victory was hollow. Tobias was gone, but the poison remained. He slowly made his way back down to the main trail, where he met Hollis, Martha, and the 2 reformed guards. They had secured Thomas, who was fading rapidly, and gathered the tools they would need. Martha, holding the tattered corporate document, was already speaking to the handful of villagers who had ventured out. Her grief was a powerful, persuasive force. "Silas is gone," she announced, her voice raw but steady, "and it was not the Lord's will. It was the poison in the earth and the betrayal of the man we trusted. Look." She held up the paper, letting them read the damning details. The copper company knew. Tobias knew. We have been drinking death for 20 years. The initial reaction was not panic, but a deep, cold shock. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the cover-up was a betrayal far worse than any mythic curse. Elias joined them, his face grim. We need to focus. The sickness is real. It is a mineral poison. It is in the water, specifically the main spring. He pulled out the bottle of silt he had scraped from the mine's sump and the jar of ore. He explained the concept as best he could, relying on the physical evidence. The mine's water drains into the main aquifer. The arsenic and, worse, the radium, a chemical that destroys the bones, is slowly leaching into the spring. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The spring was the lifeblood of Haven Ridge. But we've been drinking it for decades, Elias. An elderly woman cried out, her voice trembling. Why are only a few people sick now? Why not all of us? Elias used his knowledge of the mine's operation to explain. The main spring is deep and runs fast. Most of the poison is diluted. But 20 years ago, when the mine was operating, the concentration was much higher. That is when my father and Silas contracted the worst of it. They got a fatal dose. The smaller amounts we drink now cause slow, cumulative damage. The weakness, the joint pain, the early aging. But the mainspring, it is still the primary path of the poison. So what do we do? Hollis asked, now fully taking on the role of community leader. We can't stop drinking. Elias pointed toward the forest opposite the hollow peak. We have to reroute. We need a new source. On the north side of the ridge, there are a series of smaller, high-elevation seeps. They are fed by different bedrock, away from the copper and uranium deposits. We will have to test every single one, but we have to start now. The immediate task was immense, a physical engineering problem coupled with a crushing logistical burden. He gathered a small, pragmatic team, Hollis, who brought the necessary authority and manpower, Martha, who brought the moral weight and knowledge of the land, and a younger, skeptical man named Jeb, who owned the best tools in the village. We start with the North Ridge, Elias directed. Martha, you know the seeps better than anyone. Jeb, you bring every shovel, pick, and length of copper piping you have. We are building an aqueduct. As the team prepared to leave, the remaining Denson brother, injured but determined, came stumbling out of the woods. He looked at Elias, then at Thomas, his eyes swimming with a mixture of grief and understanding. Elias, he muttered, my brother. Is he? He's severely injured, Elias said flatly, but alive. He needs a doctor, not an elder. Your loyalty to Tobias cost him his life. But it doesn't have to cost yours or your family's. We need every able body. Are you with us, or are you still standing with the lie? The Denson brother looked at the mountain, then at the dying Thomas. He dropped his head, shame etched into every line of his face. I'm with you, Elias. Tell me what to do. The community had begun to heal its own divisions through the common enemy of the truth. The burden of leadership, which Elias had never sought, now rested heavily on his shoulders. He was no hero, just a man of science burdened with a terrifying knowledge, forced to rally a broken community. The day was spent in back-breaking labor. Elias, guided by Martha's precise knowledge of the watershed, tested the water from 3 high-altitude seeps. He had no chemical analysis equipment, only the crudest of tests from his books. A litmus test for acidity and a taste test for the unmistakable metallic tang of the mineral runoff. The first 2 seeps failed. Their water was slightly acidic and carried a faint metallic note. They reached the 3rd seep just as the sun began to drop behind the western peaks. This water flowed from a granite outcropping known locally as the Widow's Tears, and was considered too far and too difficult to access for regular use. Elias knelt and cupped his hand. The water was clear, cold and smooth, no metallic tang. The litmus paper remained neutral. This is it, Elias announced, a surge of raw relief washing over him. This water is clean. We can build from here. The task ahead was monumental. They had to lay over a mile of rudimentary piping and dig trenches through solid rock before the existing water supply ran out, or before the slow poison claimed more lives. The true horror was the invisible long-term damage already done to the people of Haven Ridge, damage that would only surface in the decades to come. Elias had won a battle, but the war against the lingering effects of the radium was just beginning. The next 3 days were a blur of exhausting, relentless labor, the entire community galvanized by Martha's testimony and Thomas's visible skeletal suffering, mobilized. Fear was still present, but it had shifted from the supernatural curse to the tangible life-or-death engineering problem before them. Elias had been right. The unity of the community was the only way they would overcome this. Men, women, and older children hauled stones, dug trenches, and laid the crude wooden and copper piping, working from dawn until the last sliver of daylight. Elias, using his few remaining tools and his knowledge of fluid dynamics, oversaw the main construction. Hollis organized the labor, using his authoritative voice to maintain order, and Martha, a pillar of quiet strength, ensured the sick were attended to and the workers were fed. The greatest challenge was the shortage of reliable piping. They salvaged every piece of copper and iron they could find, creating a patchwork system that was constantly threatening to leak or rupture. Jeb, the pragmatic tool owner, proved invaluable, devising crude pressure regulators and sealant mixtures from pine pitch and river clay. The psychological toll was immense. Every ache, every joint stiffness, every moment of fatigue was now interpreted through the terrifying lens of the radium poisoning. The community was gripped by a collective hypochondria, convinced that the chalk bones were a breath away. Elias had to constantly reassure them, explaining the slow nature of the poisoning and emphasizing the need to focus on the future. Midday on the 4th day, the sky, which had been clear, turned a metallic, sickly gray. A fierce, unseasonal thunderstorm descended upon the Ozarks. The deluge turned the trenches into rivers of mud and threatened to wash away their work. "We have to stop the work," Hollis yelled over the sound of the rain. "The trenches are flooding." "No," Elias screamed back, his clothes plastered to his skin, mud caking his face. "If we stop now, the mud will collapse the pipes and we'll lose 2 days of progress. We have to secure the main junction." Elias, Hollis, and the Denson brother, now working side by side in a silent bond of shared redemption, plunged into the deepest trench. They worked frantically to reinforce the main juncture, the crucial point where the flow from the widow's tears would finally be diverted toward the village. Lightning split the air nearby, and the thunder was a deafening, physical impact. Through the rain, Elias saw the Denson brothers' face, a mask of sheer, desperate determination. He was not just fixing a pipe, he was fighting for the life of his family, atoning for his misguided loyalty to Tobias. Finally, they sealed the junction. The water, rushing down from the high granite outcrop, was successfully diverted into the main line, bypassing the contaminated upper spring. They watched, exhausted and drenched, as the first clear, clean water rushed into the new, crude cistern they had hastily constructed near the center of the village. The sight of the pure water, bubbling clean and free of any metallic taint, brought a wave of quiet, profound emotion over the gathered community. The psychological relief was immediate. They had secured their physical survival, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. Thomas, the living witness, died that evening. He passed away peacefully, no longer in agonizing pain, having seen the truth revealed and his community saved from the lie. His death was treated not as a failure, but as a sacrifice, a final confirmation of the truth Elias had fought for. Elias stood before the assembled community by the light of a dozen lanterns. They were exhausted, bruised, and forever changed. "The water is clean," Elias announced, his voice hoarse from shouting and fatigue. "The mineral poisoning has stopped. You are safe from the source." He held up the corporate document and the jar of ore. "This is the forbidden secret. The cost of corporate greed and human cowardice. Tobias made us fear a curse so he could bury the evidence of his betrayal. We have buried him, and we have buried his lie. He paused, looking over the tired faces, the faces of survivors. But the truth is, the invisible poison will remain in the bodies of the sick for years. The damage to the bones will not heal overnight. Our work now is not just to survive, but to endure. To live with the knowledge of what happened and to ensure it never happens again. Elias knew the battle was not over. The community was physically safer, but they were spiritually and emotionally scarred. The deep-seated fear of the mountain, the suspicion of outsiders, and the lingering effects of the radium poisoning would be the burden of the next generation. The only way to move forward was to embrace the pain of the truth and the resilience of human connection. The psychological terror had ended, replaced by the somber reality of recovery. The weeks following the construction of the new aqueduct marked the beginning of a long, arduous process of healing, both physical and emotional. Haven Ridge was fundamentally altered, its foundation of fear replaced by the cold, hard rock of truth. Elias, now officially recognized as the village's doctor and most trusted voice, focused his efforts on the sick. Silas was buried beside Thomas, their graves marked with simple, smooth river stones, a small, defiant gesture against the superstitions of the past. Martha, a woman reborn in the crucible of tragedy, became Elias's steadfast assistant, tending to the surviving patients. The sick, those who had contracted the highest doses of the radium poison 20 years prior, like Elias's own father, would never fully recover. Elias used his knowledge to manage their agonizing symptoms: calcium supplements to slow the bone decay, pain tinctures, and most importantly, the simple constant reassurance that their illness was not a curse, but a physical affliction. He realized the true, lasting horror of the ordeal was the psychological damage. The community had been fractured by fear, and their trust in any form of authority, spiritual or secular, was destroyed. The resolution of the mystery, the exposure of the radium poisoning and Tobias's betrayal had provided closure, but the town had to redefine itself. Elias called a final, significant meeting, this time held in the small, simple church, now cleansed of Tobias's oppressive authority. The air was calm, smelling of fresh pine from the new repairs. He stood at the simple pulpit, the corporate document spread before him. The mountain is quiet now. The water is clean. We have done the physical work. Now we must do the work of the soul. He looked directly at the Denson brother who stood in the back, head bowed. Tobias pitted neighbor against neighbor. He used our deep mountain faith to mask his own greed. We must forgive ourselves for the fear that made us cruel. We must forgive the lies that made us turn on one another. He then looked at Martha. We have learned that the greatest poison is not a mineral in the earth, but the deliberate, cold-blooded suppression of truth. We must never allow fear to override our humanity again. Hollis, standing beside Elias, spoke next, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of his office. I will ride out. I will take this evidence to the nearest county seat, though I know the law will do little for us here. The world is at war, but these documents will be recorded. We will hold the company and the memory of what happened here accountable for the future. The meeting concluded not with a grand sermon, but with a quiet, shared understanding. The path forward would be one of constant vigilance and mutual support. Elias knew he could not stay in Haven Ridge forever. His knowledge was needed elsewhere, and the village needed to stand on its own feet. But he had one final personal piece of closure to achieve. He walked to the hollow peak one last time. He visited the site of the collapse that had swallowed Tobias, now just a scar in the landscape. The iron door of the mine, the monument to the forbidden secret, remained sealed. Elias knew the knowledge of the radioactive ore would haunt the land, a dangerous, tempting prize for future prospectors. He and Hollis devised a plan to permanently conceal the shaft, using rock and soil to erase the very location from the map. Elias spent his last evening in his cabin, packing his few books and instruments. Martha came to see him, bringing him a final, clean flask of water from the widow's tears seep. "You saved us, Elias," she said simply. "You saved us, Martha," he countered. "Your courage broke the spell of the lie. The physical truth I brought only matters because you gave it a voice." She smiled, a small, tired but genuine smile. "What will you do now?" "I will ride west. I'll find a way to learn more about this poison, to help people like Silas and my father who carry the unseen scars. This experience, it showed me the worst of human nature, but it also showed me how resilient we can be, how much power the simple, honest truth holds." The next morning, under a clear, bright Ozarks sky, Elias rode out of Haven Ridge. The village looked different now. The cabins were weathered, the people were marked by their suffering, but the light was back in their eyes. They were no longer a people cursed to slowly turn to bone, but a people burdened by a hard-won secret, the secret of corporate betrayal and human endurance. The mystery was solved. The supernatural was banished by science. The suspense of the chase was over. The lasting terror was the realistic psychological weight of the unseen scars they carried, and the quiet, determined resilience needed to live with the truth. Elias rode away, carrying the weight of the past, but focused on the long, difficult road to healing that lay ahead for himself and for the people of Haven Ridge.